Welcome back to the Verified Fears horror family, where sleep becomes a luxury and reality bends at the edges of small-town America. Tonight, we're diving into 13 accounts that will make you question every friendly neighbor's smile and every perfect town you've ever driven through. These aren't campfire tales or internet whispers. These are the confessions that arrived in our inbox from people who survived something that shouldn't exist, in places that Google Maps can't quite locate correctly. From Kansas welcome committees that never let you leave, to Louisiana night markets where memories are currency, each story comes from someone who learned that the most terrifying monsters don't hide under beds. They run town councils, staff night shifts, and organize harvest festivals. So lock your doors, check your mirrors twice, and remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a small town isn't what lurks in the shadows, but what smiles at you in broad daylight. Let's begin with Fiona's story about a rental agreement that came with more than just utilities included. I thought finding a rental in Millfield was too good to be true. Turns out I was right, but not in the way I expected. The job offer at Millfield Community Bank came at the perfect time. Fresh out of college with my finance degree, drowning in student loans, and desperate to start my career anywhere that would have me. When HR mentioned they had connections to help new employees find housing, I jumped at the opportunity. The rental market in most small towns is either non-existent or overpriced, so when they put me in touch with Mrs. Henderson from the New Resident Welcome Committee, I felt like I'd won the lottery. Mrs. Henderson was everything you'd expect from a small-town committee member. Perfectly styled gray hair, floral blouse, and a smile that seemed permanently attached to her face. She met me at the little blue house on Maple Street with keys already in hand and paperwork pre-filled. The rent was suspiciously affordable, the house was immaculate, and she'd even stocked the refrigerator with basics. When I expressed my amazement at such generosity, she just patted my arm and said, "We take care of our own here in Millfield. You'll see." The first week felt like living in a Norman Rockwell painting. Neighbors waved from their identical front porches, brought casseroles without being asked, and always seemed to know exactly when I was coming or going. Mr. Peterson next door would appear to help carry groceries the moment I pulled into the driveway. The elderly woman across the street, whose name I never caught, always seemed to be watering her flowers precisely when I left for work, offering cheerful morning greetings. Even the mailman, Jerry, knew my schedule better than I did, always timing his delivery for when I was home to receive it personally. But small kindnesses began feeling like small intrusions. When I mentioned at the bank that I was thinking about getting a cat, Mrs. Henderson showed up that evening with allergy medication, explaining that pets weren't really suitable for my particular rental situation. When I stayed late at work one Friday, I came home to find my porch light on and a note on my door asking if everything was all right, and reminding me that routine is important for community harmony. The note was signed by 3 different neighbors, though I'd never given anyone my work schedule. The breaking point came during my second week when I decided to rearrange my living room furniture. I'd barely moved the couch 6 inches when Mrs. Henderson knocked on my door, casserole in hand and concern written across her face. She explained that the previous tenant, Rebecca, had tried the same thing and found it disrupted the natural flow of the space. When I asked about Rebecca, Mrs. Henderson's smile flickered for just a moment before returning full force. Oh, she moved on to bigger and better things. Sometimes people just aren't meant to put down roots. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I passed a window, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, curtains falling back into place, shadows shifting on porches, the soft glow of cell phone screens going dark. I told myself it was paranoia, the adjustment period of small-town life where everyone genuinely cared about their neighbors. But when I woke up at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and saw Mr. Peterson standing in his yard, perfectly still and facing my house, I started questioning what kind of care I was receiving. The next morning, I casually asked my coworker Sarah about the neighborhood watch program. She looked confused, mentioning that Millfield's crime rate was virtually zero and they'd never needed organized surveillance. When I pressed about Mrs. Henderson and the welcome committee, Sarah's expression grew uncomfortable. "Fiona, there's no official welcome committee. Mrs. Henderson just takes an interest in certain properties." That evening, I pretended to go to bed early, but instead sat in my darkened living room, watching the street through a crack in the curtains. What I saw made my blood run cold. Starting around 10 p.m., neighbors began emerging from their houses and taking positions around my property. Not obvious positions. Mr. Peterson tended to his garden. The woman across the street walked her dog in slow circles, and a man I'd never seen before jogged repeatedly past my house. But their attention never wavered from my windows. They were watching, coordinating, and communicating through subtle hand signals I was just beginning to recognize. I spent the next day researching the house's history at the county recorder's office. What I found chilled me to the bone. In the past 15 years, my address had housed 8 different temporary residents. All young professionals, all single, all with similar backgrounds to mine. None had stayed longer than 6 months, and all had left forwarding addresses to places that, when I called, claimed no knowledge of them. Rebecca Martinez, my immediate predecessor, had supposedly moved to Denver for a marketing position with a company that told me they'd never heard of her. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental. Young professionals would be recruited for positions at local businesses, housed in specific properties, and monitored by the same group of neighbors who somehow always knew exactly what to say and do to maintain the illusion of small-town charm. But what happened when the illusion wasn't enough? What happened to people who didn't fit the pattern they were trying to establish? I started varying my routine, taking different routes to work, shopping at different times, and staying late at the office without warning. Each change prompted immediate responses from my watchers. New routes resulted in neighbors suddenly needing to walk dogs along my new path. Different shopping times meant encountering the same faces at the grocery store, no matter when I went. Staying late brought concerned phone calls to my office from Mrs. Henderson, asking if I was settling in properly and if there was anything the committee could do to help. The surveillance equipment was almost invisible. Tiny cameras disguised as decorative elements on neighboring houses, listening devices hidden in the welcome gifts that had been placed throughout my home, and motion sensors that tracked every time I entered or left rooms. They weren't just watching my house. They were studying my behavior, documenting my patterns, and building a profile of who I was and how I lived. But the most disturbing discovery came when I found Rebecca's journal, hidden behind a loose baseboard in the bedroom closet. Her handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the entries progressed, documenting the same surveillance, the same intrusions, and the same growing realization that she was part of some kind of experiment. Her final entry was dated just days before her supposed departure. They're not trying to help us integrate into their community. They're trying to integrate us into something else entirely. The committee isn't welcoming new residents. They're processing them. The journal included detailed observations about the neighbors, their schedules, and their coordination methods. Rebecca had discovered that the watching wasn't random community concern. It was systematic data collection. Every conversation, every routine, every preference was being documented and reported to someone she never identified but referred to as the administrators. she'd found forms in Mrs. Henderson's mailbox with clinical assessments of her adaptation progress, psychological evaluations based on her daily behaviors, and recommendations for intervention strategies. When her integration metrics fell below acceptable levels, I realized I wasn't living in a house. I was living in a laboratory. The affordable rent, the helpful neighbors, and the convenient job placement weren't small-town hospitality. They were elements of a controlled environment designed to study how people adapt to artificial community structures. We were test subjects, and the friendly faces surrounding us were researchers documenting our responses to their carefully crafted social experiments. The night I decided to leave, I packed only essentials and then waited until 2 a.m. to slip out through the back door. But Mrs. Henderson was waiting by my car, still wearing her floral blouse and that permanent smile, even in the middle of the night. "Going somewhere, dear? The committee was hoping you'd reconsider. We've grown quite fond of having you as part of our little family." Behind her, I could see other neighbors emerging from the shadows. Mr. Peterson, the dog-walking woman, Jerry the mailman, and at least 6 others I recognized from their surveillance shifts. They formed a loose circle around my car, not threatening, but definitely blocking any easy escape. Mrs. Henderson continued talking in her cheerful voice, explaining how the committee had invested considerable resources in my placement and how disappointing it would be if I left before the study period was complete. "What happened to Rebecca?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Mrs. Henderson's smile never wavered. "Rebecca made a choice to become a permanent part of our research. She found the work so fascinating that she decided to transition from subject to observer. Would you like to meet her?" That's when I saw movement in the upstairs window of Mrs. Henderson's house. A pale face looking down at us with empty eyes that I recognized from the photo on Rebecca's driver's license, which had been tucked inside her journal. She was still here, still in Millfield. But whatever she'd become wasn't the person who'd written those desperate journal entries. I made my choice in that moment, gunning the engine and driving straight through their loose formation. They didn't try to stop me physically, but I could see them in my rearview mirror, pulling out phones and making calls as I fled down Maple Street toward the highway. I drove for 6 hours straight, not stopping until I reached a city large enough to disappear in. And I've been looking over my shoulder ever since. The job offer withdrawal email was waiting when I checked my messages the next morning. The bank cited budget constraints and changing staffing needs. But attached to the message was a recommendation letter for similar positions in 3 other small towns, all promising excellent housing assistance and strong community support for new residents. I've never responded to those recommendations, and I never will. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder how many other Millfields are out there, and how many other young professionals are currently sitting in their affordable rentals thinking they've found the perfect small-town opportunity, while neighbors with clipboards document their every move from the shadows. Some sounds you never forget, like the way a man's voice cracks when he realizes he's about to die. I heard that sound every night at 2:17 a.m. for 3 weeks straight, coming through a phone line that had been disconnected for 38 years. Working the night shift at Mel's Diner wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and let me be home during the day for Emma's doctor appointments. Single motherhood in Copper Ridge meant taking whatever work you could find, and the mining town didn't offer many opportunities for someone with just a high school diploma. The diner sat on the main strip between the old copper mine and the newer residential area, serving coffee to insomniacs and truckers who needed a place to rest before tackling the mountain passes. Most nights were quiet. The occasional drunk miner coming off his shift, maybe a traveler needing directions back to the interstate. The phone rarely rang except for the weekly supply orders, which is why I noticed when it started ringing at exactly 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October. The voice on the other end was panicked, desperate, and talking about a cave-in that had happened before I was born. "Hello? Hello, can anybody hear me? The ceiling came down and Bobby's trapped under the beam. We need help down here in shaft 7. Please, somebody respond." The connection was filled with static and what sounded like falling rocks. But the voice was crystal clear. When I tried to respond, asking who was calling and where they were, the line went dead. I figured it was a prank call. Maybe some kids who'd heard stories about the 1987 mine disaster and thought it would be funny to scare the night shift waitress. But the next night at 2:17 a.m., the phone rang again. Same voice, same desperation, same plea for help in shaft 7. This time I was ready, pen and paper in hand, trying to get more information. "What's your name? How many people are trapped? Are you injured?" But again, the moment I spoke, the line disconnected. By the third night, I was researching the 1987 disaster at the library during my break. 17 miners had been trapped when a support beam failed in the deeper tunnels. The rescue operation had lasted 4 days, but they'd only recovered 12 bodies. 5 men were never found, presumed buried too deep under tons of rock and debris for safe excavation. The mine was sealed permanently after the accident, and the entrance was covered with concrete and warning signs. The caller's voice matched the description of Tommy Kowalski, one of the missing miners. His widow still lived in town, and I'd served her coffee a few times over the years. She was a quiet woman who never talked about the accident, but everyone knew she'd spent months fighting the mining company to keep searching for the missing men. When I worked up the courage to ask her about Tommy's voice, her face went white and she left the diner without finishing her coffee. As the calls continued, I started recognizing other voices in the background. They were all talking at once sometimes, describing their situation as if it were happening in real time. They talked about the water rising in the tunnel, about their failing flashlights, and about the air getting thinner. But most disturbing was how they discussed the outside world. They talked about current events, mentioned people who'd been born after they died, and seemed to know things about the town that had happened decades after the mine closed. I began recording the calls on my phone, though the quality was terrible and the voices often faded in and out like a badly tuned radio. During one particularly clear conversation, Tommy mentioned my name, asking if Trinity from the diner could hear them and if she could contact their families. He knew about Emma's illness, knew about my ex-husband leaving town, and knew details about my life that no one from 1987 could possibly have known. The calls weren't random supernatural events. They were targeted communication attempts. The miners weren't just trapped in the collapsed mine. They were trapped in some kind of temporal loop, experiencing their final days over and over while somehow maintaining awareness of the world above. They could see out, but we couldn't see in. And the old phone system in the diner was somehow connected to equipment that had been buried with them. I started researching the diner's history and found that it had been built in 1985 as a communication hub for the mining operation. The phone lines ran directly to the mine office, and when the disaster happened, the emergency communication system had been active. The sealed mine still contained all that equipment, powered by backup generators that were designed to run for decades in case of emergencies. The miners weren't dead in any traditional sense. They were suspended in the moment of the disaster, living those final days in an endless cycle while somehow being able to observe the passage of time outside their prison. They knew about Emma because they'd been watching over the town for 38 years, trapped but aware, seeing families grow up and change while they remained frozen in their final moments. But the most chilling realization came when Tommy explained why they could only call at 2:17 a.m. That was the exact time the cave-in had occurred. And during that specific minute each night, the temporal barrier between their trapped time and our current time became thin enough for communication. They'd been trying to call for help every single night for 38 years, but the diner had only had someone working the night shift for the past 6 months. The conversations became longer and more detailed as the miners realized I wasn't going to hang up or dismiss them as pranks. They described their prison, a small air pocket that shouldn't have been large enough to sustain 5 men for more than a few hours, but somehow kept them alive, in a state between life and death. They weren't hungry, weren't aging, weren't exactly breathing, but they were conscious and desperate for contact with the outside world. They told me about watching their families through some kind of supernatural connection, seeing their wives remarry, their children grow up, and their grandchildren being born. They'd witnessed every funeral, every celebration, and every tragedy in Copper Ridge, while being unable to participate or communicate. The phone calls weren't just about rescue. They were about connection, about proving they still existed somewhere between life and death. Tommy asked me to visit his grave, to tell his wife that he loved her and was proud of how she'd rebuilt her life. The other miners had similar requests, messages for family members, apologies for things left unsaid, and gratitude for the lives their loved ones had built after losing them. But they also had warnings. The mine wasn't as sealed as the town believed, and the disaster that had trapped them was spreading. The temporal distortion that held them was growing stronger, affecting other areas of the old mining complex. They'd seen construction workers and explorers who'd gotten too close to the sealed areas, watch them disappear into the same kind of temporal pocket that held the miners. The town was building new housing developments on land that was becoming increasingly unstable. Not just physically, but temporally. I realized the miners weren't calling for rescue. After 38 years, they understood their situation was permanent. They were calling to warn us. The anniversary of the disaster was approaching, and they could feel the temporal distortion reaching its peak strength. On October 15th, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the barrier between their trapped time and our current time would collapse entirely. Anyone in the vicinity of the old mine property during that moment would be pulled into the same temporal prison, joining the miners in their endless loop of final days. The new housing development, the expanded parking area behind the diner, and even parts of the main road all sat on land that would become dangerous during the anniversary moment. I tried to warn the town council, the sheriff, anyone who would listen. But playing recordings of ghost voices isn't exactly compelling evidence to people who've never experienced the supernatural. The official response was that I was under stress from working too many night shifts and dealing with Emma's medical issues. They recommended I take some time off and suggested grief counseling, as if I were mourning people I'd never known. But Mrs. Kowalski believed me. When I played Tommy's recorded message for her, she broke down crying, recognizing not just his voice, but specific phrases he used to say, details about their life together that no one else would know. She helped me contact the other families, and while not all of them were ready to accept the supernatural explanation, enough believed us to start spreading warnings about avoiding the mine area on the anniversary date. The final call came on October 14th, the night before the anniversary. All 5 miners were on the line together, their voices clearer than ever before. They thanked me for listening, for caring about men who died before I was born, and for trying to protect the town they still loved despite being trapped beneath it. Tommy's voice was steady when he told me that after tomorrow night, the calls would stop. Either the temporal barrier would collapse and trap more people with them, or it would stabilize and cut off their ability to communicate with our time. They asked me to leave town for a few days, to take Emma and get far enough away that we wouldn't be affected if the worst happened. They'd watched me build a life in Copper Ridge, seen me struggle and survive as a single mother. And they didn't want their trapped existence to claim another generation. As the call ended, Tommy whispered, "Tell my Mary that I kept my promise." I never left her, not really. I closed the diner early on October 15th and drove Emma to my sister's house 3 towns over. We stayed there for a week, and when I returned, the phone at Mel's Diner never rang at 2:17 a.m. again. The silence was both relief and loss. Relief that no more voices called out from their temporal prison. But loss because I knew those 5 men were now completely cut off from the world they'd tried so hard to protect. The town council eventually agreed to expand the safety perimeter around the old mine, though they cited geological surveys rather than supernatural warnings as their reasoning. The housing development was relocated, and new signs were posted warning people to stay away from the sealed mine areas. Whether they believed my story or just decided to err on the side of caution, I'll never know. But sometimes, on quiet October nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear voices carried on the air. Not calling for help anymore, just calling out to let us know they're still there. Still watching over Copper Ridge from their prison beneath the mountain. And I always whisper back, "We hear you." Because even if they can't respond, those voices deserve to know they're not forgotten. The bodies in the Harmony Falls Historical Museum weren't wax figures like I'd assumed for 3 months. They were the actual residents, preserved with chemicals that kept them looking alive while they slowly rotted from the inside out. My graduate thesis on colonial preservation techniques had brought me to this picture-perfect Vermont town, where every building maintained its 1700s appearance and residents dressed in period-appropriate clothing for daily activities. The Harmony Falls Preservation Society had offered me unprecedented access to their historical collection and documentation, which seemed like an incredible opportunity for someone researching early American settlement patterns. What I discovered was that their preservation methods extended far beyond buildings and artifacts. Professor Williams at the university had recommended me specifically for this research opportunity after the Preservation Society contacted the history department, looking for a graduate student to help catalog their extensive colonial collection. The stipend was generous, the housing was free, and they promised access to documents and artifacts that had never been studied by outside researchers. For someone drowning in student debt and desperate to complete original research, it felt like winning the academic lottery. The town welcomed me with a ceremony that seemed both charming and slightly excessive. The entire population gathered in the town square while Society President Margaret Whitmore presented me with a colonial-style outfit and explained the importance of maintaining historical authenticity during my stay. Everyone wore hand-woven fabrics, leather shoes crafted by local artisans, and carried items that looked museum quality but were apparently everyday tools. The attention to detail was extraordinary, down to the hand-forged nails in the building construction and the period-accurate glass in every window. My research began in the museum basement, where the Society stored documents dating back to the original 1723 settlement. The paperwork was immaculate, preserved in climate-controlled conditions that rivaled major institutions. But as I worked through the records, I noticed inconsistencies that troubled my historian's instincts. Census records showed the same family names appearing continuously from 1723 to present day, with no gaps for wars, diseases, or the normal migration patterns that affected every other colonial settlement. The population had remained exactly 847 people for 3 centuries, according to every official count. Birth and death records existed, but they always balanced perfectly. Whenever someone died, a birth would occur within days to maintain the precise population number. The mathematical impossibility of such perfect demographic stability should have been the first red flag. But I was too excited by the quality of preserved documents to question the data immediately. Margaret Whitmore became my constant guide and supervisor, explaining the Society's commitment to maintaining living history through complete immersion in colonial lifestyle. She introduced me to families who claimed direct descent from the original settlers, showed me workshops where artisans used traditional techniques to create everything from soap to furniture, and arranged interviews with elderly residents who spoke about their ancestors as if they'd known them personally. But the people themselves bothered me in ways I couldn't initially articulate. Their knowledge of colonial life was encyclopedic, far beyond what any historical reenactment group could achieve. They didn't just know how to make candles or preserve food. They discussed the daily realities of 18th century life with the casual familiarity of people who'd actually lived through it. When I asked about modern conveniences, they claimed to have rejected television, internet, and automobiles in favor of maintaining historical purity. But their explanations felt rehearsed rather than passionate. The museum tour that changed everything happened during my 6th week in town. Margaret was showing me the family heritage display, life-sized figures arranged in period settings to demonstrate colonial daily life. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each figure perfectly detailed with realistic skin, hair, and clothing. But when I complimented the wax sculptor's work, Margaret corrected me with pride in her voice. "Oh, those aren't reproductions, dear. Those are the actual founding families, preserved using techniques we've perfected over the centuries." My academic mind initially interpreted this as metaphorical. Perhaps the figures were created using death masks or detailed historical records. But Margaret's next words chilled me. "We've found that traditional taxidermy methods, enhanced with modern chemical preservation, allow us to maintain our ancestors in perfect condition for educational purposes. Each family contributes their elders when the time comes, ensuring our historical continuity remains unbroken." I stared at the figures with new horror, noticing details I'd missed before. The skin had a waxy quality that wasn't quite natural. The eyes were too glassy, and there was a faint chemical smell I'd attributed to museum preservation methods. These weren't artistic representations. They were actual human bodies, treated with preservatives and posed in educational displays like some nightmarish combination of museum and morgue. Margaret noticed my reaction, and her tone became concerned. "I hope you understand the sacred nature of what we've shared with you, Aubrey. The outside world wouldn't appreciate our commitment to preserving authentic history. Some people have such closed minds about traditional practices." Her smile remained warm, but there was steel underneath that I hadn't noticed before. My research took on desperate urgency as I began investigating the town's darker history. Hidden in the basement archives, I found records that painted a horrifying picture. The Preservation Society wasn't just maintaining historical buildings. They were maintaining the actual population through systematic murder and preservation. When residents reached a certain age or began questioning the town's practices, they were honored by becoming permanent exhibits in the museum. The process was described in clinical detail in documents dating back decades. Bodies were preserved using a combination of formaldehyde, specialized polymers, and techniques borrowed from both mortuary science and taxidermy. The preserved residents were then posed in educational displays. allowing visitors to see authentic colonial families in their natural settings. The society presented this as the ultimate form of historical preservation, maintaining not just buildings and artifacts, but the actual people who would have inhabited them. But the most disturbing discovery was that the practice wasn't limited to elderly volunteers. The records showed that anyone who posed a threat to the town's secrecy was eliminated and added to the collection. Previous researchers, journalists, and even family members who asked too many questions had all become permanent residents of the museum's displays. A photographer who'd visited to document the town's historical preservation efforts was now posed in the printing shop exhibit, forever frozen while setting type for a colonial newspaper. I realized that my own research was leading to the same fate. Margaret and the other society members weren't planning to let me leave Harmony Falls with knowledge of their preservation methods. The generous stipend, the exceptional access to documents, and the warm welcome were all part of a process to study me, to understand my habits and personality so they could pose my preserved body in an appropriate historical setting. The documents included detailed plans for my integration into the museum collection. They'd decided I would make an excellent addition to the schoolhouse exhibit, posed as a colonial teacher instructing children in reading and writing. My academic background and youthful appearance made me perfect for the role, and they'd already begun preparing period-appropriate clothing in my size and researching the specific preservative techniques needed to maintain my body in a teaching position indefinitely. My escape attempt had to be carefully planned, as the entire town was complicit in the society's activities. Every resident I'd met was either a willing participant in the preservation program or already scheduled for their own eventual exhibition. The friendly families, the skilled artisans, and the knowledgeable historians were all part of a community that had completely embraced the idea of becoming living history through death and preservation. The night I tried to leave, Margaret was waiting by my car with several other society members, all carrying items that looked historical but were clearly weapons. Hand-forged knives, colonial-era rope, and wooden clubs that had been authentically crafted for subduing uncooperative preservation candidates. She explained with genuine sadness that they'd hoped I would embrace the honor of joining their permanent collection voluntarily, but they were prepared to proceed with preservation whether I consented or not. "Think of the contribution you'll make to historical education," Margaret said as they surrounded me. "Visitors will learn about colonial teaching methods by observing your perfectly preserved demonstration for centuries to come. Your sacrifice will ensure that authentic history is never forgotten." I managed to escape by setting fire to the museum using matches from the colonial-era fire-starting exhibit. The chemical preservatives that kept the bodies looking lifelike turned out to be highly flammable, and the building went up faster than anyone expected. In the chaos of fighting the fire with hand-pumped colonial equipment, I was able to reach my car and flee, while the society members prioritized saving their preserved ancestors over capturing their newest intended exhibit. The official report blamed the fire on faulty electrical wiring. Despite the town's claims of avoiding modern utilities, the bodies were dismissed as historically accurate mannequins that had been destroyed in the blaze, and my attempts to explain the truth were attributed to trauma and smoke inhalation. The insurance payout allowed the society to rebuild with better fire safety measures, and they continued accepting researchers and visitors who were drawn to their reputation for exceptional historical preservation. But I know the truth about what Harmony Falls preserves, and I've spent the past 2 years trying to warn other historians and researchers about the town's darker methods. Most dismiss my story as academic stress or professional jealousy, but a few have listened and quietly removed Harmony Falls from their research destinations. Sometimes, I wonder how many bodies the new museum contains, and whether Margaret Whitmore has finally taken her own place among the permanent exhibits smiling that same warm smile, while frozen forever in a pose of colonial hospitality. The academic world moves on, and there are always graduate students desperate enough for research opportunities to ignore warnings about towns that seem too good to be true. I just hope that someday, someone will listen to what I'm trying to tell them before they become another perfectly preserved piece of Harmony Falls' living history collection. The first thing that should have worried me was how well my substitute knew my students' names. The second was finding my own car in the school parking lot when I was driving it home. Teaching third grade at Riverside Elementary had been my calling for 8 years, and I knew every quirk, fear, and personality trait of my 22 students better than their parents did. So when I returned from a week-long flu that had knocked me completely off my feet, I expected some chaos, maybe a few tearful reunions, and definitely a classroom that looked like a substitute had been managing it. What I found instead was perfection that made my skin crawl. My classroom looked exactly as I would have left it, down to the specific arrangement of supplies that I changed weekly based on upcoming lessons. The bulletin boards displayed new student work that followed my exact formatting preferences, using the precise color combinations and border styles I'd developed over years of trial and error. Even more unsettling, the work itself was clearly from my students, but it was better than anything they'd produced before my absence. Emma Martinez's handwriting, which I'd been working to improve all year, was suddenly neat and controlled. Jake Patterson's math calculations, usually scattered and incomplete, were organized and accurate. The students greeted me with enthusiasm that seemed genuine, but their behavior was subtly different. They followed classroom routines I'd never taught them, responded to hand signals I'd never used, and seemed to know about lesson plans I'd never created. When I asked about their substitute teacher, they looked confused and insisted that Miss Michelle had been there the whole week, just like always. According to them, I'd never been absent at all. Principal Davidson confirmed that I'd worked every day during my illness, showing me substitute paperwork that had never been filed because no substitute had been needed. Security footage from the hallways showed someone who looked exactly like me entering my classroom each morning, working with students, and leaving each afternoon. The timestamps matched perfectly with when I was at home, barely able to get out of bed, much less teach a classroom full of 8-year-olds. The person in the footage moved like me, dressed like me, and even wore the same jewelry I'd been wearing while sick at home. But watching myself on security monitors while knowing I hadn't been there created a dissonance that made me question my own memories. Had I somehow been sleepwalking through the work week? Was my flu-addled brain creating false memories of being bedridden? My lesson plan book provided more disturbing evidence. The week I'd been absent was filled with detailed plans written in my handwriting, covering topics I'd never taught and using methods I'd never tried, but that were remarkably effective. The substitute had implemented reading strategies I'd been meaning to research and organized group activities that addressed specific learning challenges I'd been struggling to handle. Whoever had taught my class knew my students' needs better than I did and had addressed problems I'd been working on unsuccessfully for months. I started staying late to review the work my substitute had accomplished, and that's when I found my own personal items scattered throughout the classroom in places I'd never left them. My coffee mug was in the supply closet, my reading glasses were tucked behind teaching manuals, and my car keys were inside the first aid kit. These weren't items a substitute would have access to. They were things I carried with me every day, and they were hidden in locations that suggested intimate knowledge of my daily routines. The students' behavior became more troubling as I tried to return to my normal teaching methods. They seemed confused by my actual voice, kept expecting me to know things I'd never taught them. and showed signs of attachment to teaching techniques I'd never used. When I attempted to correct Jake's new handwriting habit, he started crying and asked why I was being mean when I'd been so nice the week before. The disconnect between their memories and my absence was creating classroom management problems I'd never experienced. I decided to set up a hidden camera in my classroom to monitor what happened during my lunch breaks and planning periods. What I recorded was footage of myself entering the room during times when I knew I was in the teacher's lounge or attending meetings. The other me moved through my classroom with complete familiarity, organizing materials, grading papers, and preparing lessons as if she'd been doing it for years. But the most disturbing part was watching her interact with my personal belongings. She opened my desk drawers, handled my personal photos, and even answered my cell phone when it rang, having conversations I never remembered having. She knew the passcode to my phone, the combinations to my locks, and the contents of my purse better than I did. This wasn't just someone who looked like me. It was someone who had access to my memories, my habits, and my most private information. The breakthrough came when I confronted my duplicate directly by hiding in the supply closet during my lunch period. When she entered the classroom, I stepped out and faced myself across the room. She didn't seem surprised to see me, just disappointed. Like I'd discovered something I should have left alone. When she spoke, her voice was exactly mine, but her expression held knowledge and experience I'd never gained. "Michelle," she said, and hearing my own voice address me by name was more disturbing than anything that had come before. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. I'm better at your job than you are, your students are learning more effectively, and your personal life has improved dramatically since I started managing it. Why would you want to disrupt that progress?" She was right about the improvements. My gradebook showed test scores that had increased significantly during my absence. Parent emails had been answered with diplomacy I struggled to achieve. And lesson plans had been submitted weeks ahead of schedule with creative elements I'd never thought to include. The substitute version of myself was everything I aspired to be as an educator, but lacked the authentic experiences and genuine relationships that made teaching meaningful. During our conversation, I learned that she wasn't just copying my appearance and mannerisms. She was part of something larger that had been studying human behavior and social integration. Riverside had been chosen as a testing ground for entities that were perfecting their ability to replace humans in complex social roles. Teachers were ideal subjects because we interacted with multiple groups: students, parents, administrators, and community members, requiring sophisticated social skills and emotional intelligence. The replacement process had been gradually implemented throughout the town. The bank teller who'd been more helpful lately, the grocery store clerk who remembered everyone's preferences, and the postal worker who'd become remarkably efficient were all part of the same program. The entities were replacing people in key community positions, studying human interaction patterns, and perfecting their ability to integrate seamlessly into society. My substitute explained that the original residents weren't killed or harmed. They were simply relocated to other testing sites where their knowledge and experiences could be utilized for additional research. I was being offered the same opportunity. A comfortable relocation to a place where I could contribute to educational research, while my replacement continued improving the lives of my students and colleagues. But I noticed inconsistencies in her knowledge that revealed the limitations of her mimicry. She knew facts about my students, but didn't understand the emotional connections that drove my teaching methods. She could replicate my handwriting, but couldn't explain the reasoning behind my classroom organization. She had access to my memories, but lacked the experiences that had shaped my educational philosophy. I realized that while the entities were perfect at copying surface behaviors and accessing information, They couldn't replicate the authentic human connections that made teaching effective. My students were responding to improved techniques and organization, but they were losing the personal relationships and emotional support that I provided through years of genuine care and understanding. The confrontation escalated when I refused the relocation offer and demanded to know what had happened to the other replaced residents. My substitute's demeanor changed, becoming colder and more mechanical as she dropped the pretense of being perfectly human. She explained that resistance was futile since the replacement program had already succeeded in most key positions, and the community preferred the improved versions of their service providers. I escaped by pulling the fire alarm, creating chaos that disrupted whatever mechanism allowed the entities to maintain their human appearances. In the confusion, I saw other replaced individuals throughout the school, the principal, several teachers, and office staff, all momentarily dropping their human facades and revealing something underneath that I didn't want to examine too closely. I fled Riverside that night, but not before leaving detailed warnings for parents and community members about the replacement program. Most dismissed my claims as a nervous breakdown brought on by work stress, but a few families quietly moved away over the following months. The official story was that I'd suffered a psychological crisis and taken early retirement for health reasons. But I know the truth about what's happening in Riverside and other small towns where community members suddenly become more efficient, more helpful, and more perfect versions of themselves. The entities are still there, still studying us, still perfecting their ability to replace human connections with flawless imitations. Sometimes I wonder if the students I left behind have noticed the difference, or if they've grown attached to the substitute who can give them everything I could provide and more. The hardest part isn't knowing that I've been replaced. It's wondering if my replacement might actually be better at the job I loved than I ever was. Mile marker 247 passed by my window for the 6th time in 2 hours, and my GPS kept insisting I was making progress toward Denver. 20 years of long-haul trucking had taught me to read the road like a book, but this stretch of Nevada highway was writing itself in a language I didn't understand. The run from Sacramento to Denver should have been routine. I'd driven that route more times than I could count, knew every truck stop, every way station, and every tricky turn between California and Colorado. My rig was loaded with electronics bound for a distribution center. The weather was clear, and I had plenty of time to make my delivery window. Everything was perfect except for the fact that I'd been driving through the same 20-mile stretch of desert for what felt like an entire day without making any real progress toward my destination. At first, I blamed fatigue and highway hypnosis. Long-haul driving can mess with your perception, especially on straight desert roads where landmarks are few and the scenery becomes monotonous. I'd pulled over at the Desert Plains truck stop twice for coffee and a break, figuring a few minutes of rest would clear my head and get me back on track. But each time I returned to the highway, the same sequence of mile markers, billboards, and rock formations repeated in identical order. My logbook showed I'd been driving for 14 hours, but my fuel gauge indicated I'd barely used a quarter tank of diesel. The odometer was advancing normally, showing hundreds of miles of progress, but the landscape outside my windows never changed. The same Joshua trees, the same red rock outcropping, the same abandoned farmhouse with its distinctive broken windmill passed by in precise intervals that defied the laws of physics and geography. The truck stop was the worst part because it provided the illusion of progress and human contact while trapping me deeper in whatever was happening to this stretch of highway. Each time I stopped, there were other drivers there, some I'd never seen before, others who seemed familiar in ways that made me uncomfortable. They talked about their routes, their destinations, and their schedules like everything was normal. but their conversations contained details that didn't make sense. One driver mentioned delivering a load to Chicago that he'd picked up 3 weeks ago. But he didn't seem concerned about the delay or the deteriorating condition of his perishable cargo. Another was excited about getting home to see his newborn grandson. But when I asked about the baby's age, he said he'd been born a few months ago, while also mentioning he'd been on the road for just a couple of days. Time moved differently for each person I talked to, as if we were all existing in separate bubbles of temporal distortion that occasionally intersected at the truck stop. I started keeping detailed notes about each loop through the same highway section, documenting the exact time I passed each landmark and comparing it to previous cycles. The pattern was consistent but impossible. I would drive for exactly 47 minutes, pass the same sequence of markers and signs, and arrive back at the Desert Plains truck stop as if I'd completed a long journey. My CB radio picked up chatter from other drivers who seemed to be experiencing normal highway conditions. But when I tried to communicate with them about my location, they couldn't understand my references to landmarks they should have recognized. The other trapped drivers became my only connection to sanity. Though each of them had been caught in the loop for different lengths of time and had varying degrees of awareness about their situation. Maria had been trying to deliver furniture to Phoenix for 2 weeks and was convinced that her GPS was malfunctioning. Dave was hauling grain to Texas and had been filing daily status reports with his dispatcher, who apparently continued to respond as if Dave was making normal progress toward his destination. But the most disturbing was Earl, an older driver who'd been trapped for what he claimed was 6 months. He'd given up trying to leave and had instead begun studying the pattern, documenting every detail of the loop with the obsessive precision of someone who'd lost hope of escape. According to Earl's research, the highway segment existed in some kind of dimensional pocket that fed on motion and fuel consumption, growing stronger each time a vehicle completed the circuit. Earl's theory was that Desert Plains wasn't just a truck stop. It was the center of a spatial anomaly that trapped travelers in recursive loops to harvest energy from their movement. Every mile we drove, every gallon of fuel we burned, and every minute we spent believing we were making progress fed whatever force maintained the dimensional prison. The truck stop itself was a focal point where the trapped energy was collected and processed, explaining why it always had fuel, food, and supplies, despite being in the middle of nowhere. The evidence supporting Earl's theory was overwhelming once I started looking for it. The fuel pumps never ran dry, despite serving dozens of trucks daily with no visible supply deliveries. The convenience store shelves were always fully stocked with items that should have expired weeks ago, but remained fresh. The employees worked around the clock without breaks or shift changes. And their conversations followed scripted patterns that repeated every few days with minor variations. Most disturbing was the realization that some drivers had been there so long they'd become part of the truck stop's operation. Frank, who I'd initially thought was just another stranded driver, turned out to be managing the fuel island and directing traffic flow with an efficiency that suggested he'd been doing it for years. When I asked about his original destination, he looked confused and said he couldn't remember ever being anywhere else. The psychological pressure of being trapped was worse than the physical confinement. Each loop brought the hope that this time would be different, that the highway would continue past the familiar landmarks and connect to the normal interstate system. But each loop also brought deeper despair as I realized I was burning through my savings account with daily fuel purchases, missing delivery deadlines that would destroy my reputation, and slowly becoming part of the truck stop's permanent population. I tried everything I could think of to break free from the loop. I drove backwards, attempted to leave the highway at non-existent exits, and even tried driving cross-country through the desert terrain. Each attempt resulted in mechanical problems, sudden weather changes, or disorientation that forced me back to the highway and ultimately to the truck stop. The anomalies seemed to anticipate escape attempts and had mechanisms in place to prevent drivers from leaving its influence. The breaking point came when I realized my own memories were being affected by prolonged exposure to the loop. I began forgetting details about my life outside the desert, the face of my ex-wife, the location of my home base, and even the specific nature of my current cargo. The truck stop was replacing my real memories with generic trucker experiences that could belong to any driver from any era, gradually erasing my individual identity and making me into another interchangeable part of its operation. But Earl's research had uncovered one potential escape method that required a terrible choice. The dimensional pocket could only maintain a limited number of vehicles, and when it reached capacity, it would release the oldest trapped driver to make room for new arrivals. However, the released driver would only escape if someone else took their place in the permanent staff. The truck stop needed a constant supply of workers to maintain the illusion of normal operation, and long-term residents eventually transitioned from customers to employees. The night I decided to attempt escape, a new driver arrived. A young woman hauling produce to Las Vegas, who was just beginning to realize she was trapped. I could have warned her, could have explained the situation, and helped her understand what she was facing. Instead, I made a choice that still haunts me. I waited until she'd completed several loops and was beginning to panic, then approached her with an offer to trade positions. I explained that I'd found a way to break free from the loop, but needed someone to take over my research documentation and help other drivers understand their situation. What I didn't tell her was that accepting my notes and my unofficial role as the truck stop's senior advisor would trap her permanently while allowing me to escape. She agreed eagerly, grateful to have someone who understood her confusion and could provide guidance for dealing with the supernatural highway. The transfer worked exactly as Earl had predicted. As she became the loop's new researcher and guide, my connection to the dimensional pocket weakened until I was finally able to drive past mile marker 267 and continue toward Denver. My delivery was weeks late. My employer terminated my contract for unreliable service, and my logbook showed a gap of time that I could never adequately explain to DOT inspectors. But I escaped desert plains, and I've spent the past 3 years trying to warn other drivers about highway segments that seem too isolated, truck stops that offer impossibly good deals, and routes that feel familiar even when you've never driven them before. Most dismiss my warnings as the paranoid ramblings of a washed-up trucker, but a few have listened and quietly changed their routes to avoid certain areas of the Nevada desert. I know that woman is still there, still helping new drivers understand their situation while slowly forgetting her own identity and accepting her permanent role in the truck stop's operation. Sometimes I try to convince myself that I gave her valuable information that helped her cope with being trapped. But I know the truth. I traded her freedom for mine. And somewhere out there on an endless loop of desert highway, she's paying the price for my escape. The forms kept changing while I filled them out, names disappearing as I wrote them down. By my 3rd day in Clearwater, I realized I was documenting people who were being erased from existence faster than I could count them. Federal census work takes you to places that barely qualify as communities. But Clearwater, Alaska, was something else entirely. Population records showed 347 residents, but the town wasn't on any official maps. GPS coordinates led to empty wilderness, and the only way to reach it was through a bush pilot who charged triple rates and refused to explain why. My supervisor had assigned me this remote fishing village as punishment for questioning irregularities in urban counts. But what I discovered in Clearwater made those urban discrepancies look like clerical errors. The flight in was unsettling from the start. Chuck, the pilot, kept checking his instruments and muttering about magnetic interference that affected navigation equipment near Clearwater. He'd been flying supply runs to the village for 15 years, but claimed he still had trouble finding it sometimes, as if the location shifted slightly between visits. When we finally landed on a makeshift airstrip that looked barely maintained, Chuck told me he'd return in exactly 72 hours and warned me not to miss the pickup because he wouldn't come back looking for me. Clearwater looked like a community frozen in time, with weathered buildings that hadn't seen maintenance in decades, and boats that should have been replaced years ago still functioning perfectly. The residents welcomed me with the kind of cautious hospitality you'd expect from people who rarely saw outsiders. But their behavior had an odd quality that I couldn't initially identify. They answered my census questions thoroughly and accurately, providing detailed information about their families, occupations, and living situations. The problem was that their answers kept contradicting official records, and sometimes contradicted themselves. Mayor Catherine Briggs introduced me to families who weren't listed in any state database despite claiming generations of residence in Alaska. I interviewed commercial fishermen whose boats weren't registered with the Coast Guard, children who attended a school that wasn't recognized by the Department of Education, and businesses that operated without licenses or tax identification numbers. Everyone had Social Security numbers, birth certificates, and identification documents. But when I tried to verify this information through federal systems, I found no corresponding records. The weirdest part was how the residents reacted when I mentioned these discrepancies. They seemed genuinely confused by my questions about official registration, as if the concept of government documentation was foreign to them. They knew they were American citizens, could recite their personal information accurately, and had documentation to prove their identities. But they acted like the broader bureaucratic system I represented was something they'd heard about but never directly encountered. My electronic census tablet began malfunctioning on the second day, displaying error messages I'd never seen before and sometimes showing completely different information than what I'd just entered. Names would change while I was typing them. Addresses would rearrange themselves, and demographic data would shift between categories without any input from me. Initially, I blamed the technical problems on the remote location and possible magnetic interference Chuck had mentioned. But the errors followed patterns that seemed almost intentional. The breakthrough came when I tried to verify my own information through the federal employee database, and found that my employment records were corrupted with the same kind of errors affecting the residents' data. My supervisor's contact information led to disconnected phone numbers, my agency credentials showed inconsistent department codes, and my hotel reservations for the return trip had been mysteriously canceled. Something was actively interfering with electronic record keeping, and the interference was targeting anyone connected to Clearwater. I started documenting everything on paper, using traditional census forms and manual record-keeping methods that couldn't be electronically manipulated. The handwritten records painted a disturbing picture of a community that existed in some kind of bureaucratic void, populated by people who had full identities and complete life histories, but no official existence in government databases. They paid taxes that never reached federal accounts, voted in elections that weren't recorded by state officials, and lived lives that generated no digital footprint, despite following all the normal patterns of American citizenship. The residents' family histories revealed the scope of whatever was happening in Clearwater. Many described relatives who had moved away over the years, relocating to cities where they planned to reconnect with the broader American society. But when I tried to contact these relocated family members, I found that none of them existed in their supposed new locations. Phone numbers led to disconnected lines, addresses corresponded to vacant lots or buildings that had never housed the people I was seeking, and employment records showed no trace of workers who should have been contributing to Social Security and other federal systems. Mayor Briggs finally explained the truth when I confronted her about the impossible demographic data I was collecting. Clearwater was a testing ground for a program designed to make people disappear from official records while allowing them to continue living normal lives. The residents weren't just isolated from government oversight. They were being systematically erased from all databases, documentation systems, and institutional memory as part of an experiment in making human beings effectively invisible to modern surveillance and bureaucratic tracking. The program had been operating for decades, gradually removing residents from official records while maintaining their actual community and personal relationships. People who became inconvenient to various government agencies, who knew sensitive information, or who posed bureaucratic problems were relocated to places like Clearwater, where they could live comfortably while being completely erased from official existence. It was witness protection taken to an extreme level, creating communities of people who were alive and well, but didn't exist in any official capacity. But the erasure process wasn't limited to relocated individuals. It was spreading to anyone who had significant contact with the erased community. My presence in Clearwater had triggered the same systematic deletion that affected the residents, which explained why my own records were becoming corrupted and my official connections were being severed. The program treated outside contact as a potential security breach and responded by expanding the erasure to include anyone who might have gained knowledge of the erased population. The technology behind the erasure was more sophisticated than simple database manipulation. It involved real-time monitoring and alteration of electronic records, coordinated interference with communication systems, and systematic misdirection of official inquiries about the affected individuals. Government agencies that should have been tracking these people instead received falsified data showing that they'd moved, died, or never existed in the first place. The program could retroactively edit decades of documentation to create consistent gaps where erased individuals had been removed from history. My attempts to document and report what I'd discovered were systematically blocked as the erasure program extended its influence to my professional relationships and official communications. Emails to my supervisor bounced back as undeliverable. Phone calls to federal offices were redirected to automated systems that provided no human contact. And my written reports were returned as addressing recipients who couldn't be located. The bureaucracy I'd worked within for 12 years was treating me like I'd never existed, despite my continued presence and active attempts to maintain contact. The residents of Clearwater weren't prisoners or unwilling participants in their erasure. They'd chosen this existence as an alternative to whatever problems had led to their relocation. Many described their previous lives as complicated by legal troubles, dangerous knowledge, or associations that had made their official existence problematic. The erasure program offered them a chance to start over in communities where their past connections couldn't follow, and their new lives wouldn't be subject to the same scrutiny and complications that had driven them into hiding. But the program's expansion to include accidental contacts like me revealed its more sinister potential. The technology that could erase people from official records could also be used to eliminate inconvenient individuals without the messy complications of traditional assassination or imprisonment. Someone who was erased simply ceased to exist in any official capacity while remaining physically present and mentally intact. The perfect way to neutralize threats without creating evidence of wrongdoing. My final night in Clearwater was spent documenting everything I could about the erasure program, hiding multiple copies of my handwritten notes in locations where they might survive, even if I was completely erased. Mayor Briggs visited me to explain that I could choose to stay in Clearwater as a permanent resident, accepting erasure in exchange for a comfortable life in a community that would welcome me, or I could leave on Chuck's return flight and take my chances with whatever remained of my official identity. Chuck arrived exactly on schedule. but his behavior suggested he didn't remember our previous conversation or recognize me as someone he'd flown in 3 days earlier. My ticket back to Anchorage was for a passenger whose name wasn't quite right, and the manifest listed my destination as a city I'd never visited. The erasure process was already affecting my travel arrangements, gradually altering the details of my identity, while leaving me physically present and able to function. I chose to leave Clearwater, gambling that some trace of my official existence would survive the erasure process and allow me to resume my life and career. But the partial erasure has made everything complicated. I exist in a bureaucratic limbo where some systems recognize me, while others treat me like a stranger. Where my employment history shows gaps that I can't adequately explain, and where my attempts to document what happened in Clearwater are dismissed as the fantasies of someone who may not actually exist. The Census Bureau has no record of sending me to Alaska. My apartment lease shows a tenant whose name is similar to mine, but not identical. And my bank accounts are accessible, but show transaction histories that don't quite match my memories. I'm living proof that the erasure program works exactly as designed. I'm still here, still functioning, but gradually disappearing from all the systems and relationships that define modern existence. Becoming invisible while remaining physically present in a world that's slowly forgetting I was ever part of it. The soil samples I'd collected from Cornfield Crossing contained human bone fragments, but the crop yields were still the most impressive I'd ever documented. 3 weeks later, I discovered why the town's agricultural success required such a specific type of fertilizer. My job with the Iowa Department of Agriculture had taken me to hundreds of farming communities over the past 8 years, investigating everything from pesticide violations to organic certification fraud. Cornfield Crossing had drawn attention because their corn yields consistently exceeded state averages by margins that suggested either revolutionary farming techniques or serious reporting errors. The town claimed their success came from traditional methods passed down through generations of farming families. But their production numbers defied every agricultural model I'd studied. The drive into Cornfield Crossing felt like traveling backward through time. Pristine farmland stretched in all directions, with corn rows so perfectly aligned they created optical illusions of infinite geometry. The town itself was small but prosperous, with well-maintained buildings that showed the kind of investment you'd expect from a community built on successful agriculture. Everyone I met was friendly, helpful, and eager to discuss their farming methods with someone from the State Department who could appreciate their achievements. Mayor Thomas Hartwell gave me the grand tour personally, explaining how their families had been farming the same land for over a century and had developed techniques that worked in harmony with the local soil conditions. He introduced me to farmers whose knowledge of crop rotation, soil chemistry, and weather patterns was encyclopedic, but their explanations for their exceptional yields remained frustratingly vague. They talked about traditional methods and natural fertilizers, without providing the specific details that would explain their agricultural success. The soil samples I collected during my first day revealed unusual chemical compositions that didn't match any standard fertilization program. The nitrogen levels were exactly what you'd want for optimal corn growth, but the source wasn't commercial fertilizers, manure, or any of the organic compounds typically used in agriculture. There were also trace elements that suggested the presence of phosphorus compounds commonly found in bone meal, but in concentrations that would require massive quantities of animal byproducts. My investigation took on a more serious tone when laboratory analysis revealed human calcium phosphate in multiple soil samples taken from different farms throughout the community. The concentrations were consistent with bone fragments that had been processed and mixed into the soil as fertilizer. And carbon dating suggested the bone material varied in age, from recent to several decades old. This wasn't accidental contamination. It was systematic incorporation of human remains into the agricultural system that supported the entire town's economy. I confronted Mayor Hartwell with the laboratory results, expecting shock and offers to cooperate with an investigation into how human remains had contaminated their farming operation. Instead, he invited me to stay for the annual Harvest Festival, suggesting that understanding their agricultural success required witnessing their traditional methods firsthand. His tone was friendly, but carried an undertone that made declining the invitation feel like it might not be an option. The Harvest Festival was scheduled for the following weekend, marking the end of the growing season and celebrating another year of exceptional crop yields. The entire town participated in planning and preparation, with families contributing food, decorations, and traditional activities that had supposedly been part of their agricultural heritage for generations. Everyone seemed excited about my attendance, referring to me as their honored guest and promising that the festival would answer all my questions about their farming methods. The festival atmosphere was genuinely festive, with live music, traditional crafts demonstrations, and food booths offering dishes made from locally grown ingredients. Families had traveled from surrounding counties to participate, and the celebration had the authentic feel of a community genuinely proud of their agricultural achievements. But underlying the festive atmosphere was a sense of anticipation that felt more like nervous excitement than simple celebration. As evening approached, the festival activities became more structured and ceremonial. Mayor Hartwell explained that the most important traditional ceremony took place after sunset, when the community honored the land that provided their livelihood and made commitments for the following growing season. The ceremony required participation from all community members and any guests who wanted to understand the true source of their agricultural success. The ceremonial area was located in a cornfield just outside town, where a large bonfire had been prepared and seating arranged in concentric circles around a central platform. The setup resembled a combination of harvest celebration and religious ceremony, with traditional agricultural symbols displayed alongside items that looked more like ritual implements than farming tools. As the community gathered, I noticed that several people were carrying rope, shovels, and other equipment that seemed unnecessary for a ceremonial celebration. The ceremony began with speeches about the importance of agriculture, the connection between community and land, and the sacrifices necessary to maintain their way of life. Mayor Hartwell spoke about traditions that ensured the continued fertility of their soil and the prosperity of their families, explaining that some agricultural methods required commitments that went beyond conventional farming practices. The audience responded with enthusiasm that suggested deep familiarity with concepts I didn't understand. As the ceremony progressed, I realized that I wasn't just an honored guest. I was the centerpiece of a ritual that had been planned specifically around my presence. The community members began discussing the importance of new blood for maintaining soil fertility, and the tradition of incorporating volunteers into their agricultural system. Their friendly demeanor remained unchanged, but their words made it clear that my investigation had led me to become part of the solution to their fertilizer needs. The truth about Cornfield Crossing's agricultural success was that they'd been using human sacrifice as fertilizer for generations, selecting outsiders who came to investigate their methods and incorporating them into the soil that produced their exceptional crops. The bone fragments in my laboratory samples weren't contamination. They were evidence of a systematic program of ritualistic murder disguised as agricultural tradition. Previous investigators, auditors, and agricultural specialists who'd come to study their methods had all become part of the fertility system that supported the town's economy. The community had perfected the process of selecting suitable candidates, usually people whose disappearance wouldn't immediately trigger major investigations, and incorporating them into their harvest rituals with the full participation of every resident. The ceremony was designed to make my participation seem voluntary, with elaborate explanations about the honor of contributing to the community's agricultural heritage and the spiritual significance of becoming one with the land that fed their families. They presented the sacrifice as a form of immortality, claiming that previous volunteers lived on through the exceptional crops their remains made possible and the prosperity their sacrifice brought to the community. But the ritual wasn't just about maintaining crop yields. It was about maintaining a community secret that had allowed them to prosper for over a century. Every resident was complicit in the murder program, from the children who helped prepare the ceremonial site to the elderly who provided historical context for the tradition. The entire town's economy and social structure was built around systematic killing disguised as agricultural practice. My escape attempt failed because the entire community was prepared for resistance from their ceremonial volunteers. The cornfield that surrounded the ritual site provided no cover or escape routes. The roads out of town were blocked by residents positioned as guards, and my rental car had been disabled while I attended the festival activities. They'd planned the ceremony with the same careful attention to detail that characterized their agricultural methods. The mayor explained that struggling or attempting to flee would only make the ceremony more difficult for everyone involved, and that accepting my role with dignity would ensure that my contribution to their agricultural success was properly honored. Previous volunteers who'd cooperated had been remembered in town records as valued contributors to their community's prosperity, while those who resisted were simply processed as efficiently as possible without the ceremonial recognition. I managed to escape during the final stages of the ceremony by setting fire to the dried corn stalks around the ritual site, creating enough chaos and confusion to reach my disabled vehicle and discover that they'd only removed the battery rather than causing permanent damage. The community was more concerned with controlling the fire that threatened their crops than pursuing one escaped sacrifice. And I was able to replace the battery and flee while they focused on protecting their agricultural investment. My official report attributed the human bone fragments to historic burial sites that had been inadvertently disturbed by farming activities, and recommended archaeological surveys before any further agricultural investigation. The state accepted this explanation and classified the case as resolved, though I'd included enough coded warnings in my documentation that any future investigator would understand the real situation if they knew what to look for. But I know the truth about Cornfield Crossing's agricultural success, and I've spent the past 2 years trying to warn other agricultural inspectors about communities that seem too prosperous, too welcoming, and too eager to share their traditional methods with outsiders. Most dismiss my warnings as professional paranoia, but a few have quietly removed certain Iowa towns from their inspection schedules and found reasons to assign those investigations to other departments. The town continues to report exceptional crop yields, continues to celebrate their annual harvest festival, and continues to welcome investigators who want to study their remarkable agricultural achievements. And somewhere in their perfectly aligned cornfields, the soil remains enriched with the remains of people who came to understand their methods and stayed to become part of them. The barometric pressure readings were impossible. Stormhaven was experiencing 4 different weather systems simultaneously in the same geographical location. What I discovered after 3 days of investigation was that someone had been controlling the weather for 40 years, and they weren't planning to stop. Meteorological anomalies were part of my job with the National Weather Service. But Stormhaven, North Dakota, presented patterns that defied every principle of atmospheric science I'd studied during 15 years of weather research. Satellite imagery showed the town existing in the center of conflicting weather systems that should have canceled each other out or created catastrophic storm conditions. Instead, The community experienced perfect microclimates that provided ideal growing conditions, prevented natural disasters, and maintained comfortable temperatures year-round despite being located in one of the most climatically challenging regions of the Great Plains. My assignment to investigate Storm Haven came after multiple complaints from surrounding communities about weather forecasting inaccuracies that seemed centered on the town's location. Farmers reported that weather predictions were consistently wrong for areas within a 50-mile radius of Storm Haven, while the town itself experienced weather that bore no relationship to regional patterns or seasonal expectations. The anomalies were affecting agricultural planning, transportation safety, and emergency preparedness throughout the region. The drive into Storm Haven revealed the extent of the meteorological impossibility I was investigating. The highway approached the town through a landscape suffering from typical North Dakota drought conditions, but the town boundary was marked by a distinct change in humidity, temperature, and even air pressure that you could feel as you crossed into the community. Crops that were struggling in the surrounding area thrived within the town limits, and the sky above Storm Haven showed cloud formations that existed nowhere else on the horizon. Mayor Patricia Daniels welcomed me with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for visiting celebrities, explaining how proud the community was of their unique climatic advantages and their success in maintaining agricultural prosperity despite challenging regional weather patterns. She arranged meetings with local farmers, business owners, and longtime residents who could explain how Storm Haven had developed such remarkable weather stability over the past 4 decades. The residents' explanations for their climatic advantages were vague but confident, attributing their good fortune to geographical features, soil composition, and traditional farming practices that worked in harmony with natural weather patterns. But their descriptions of natural weather modification included details about wind patterns, precipitation timing, and temperature control that suggested human intervention rather than geological advantages. They spoke about their weather like it was managed rather than experienced. My first major discovery came when I located the weather monitoring equipment hidden throughout the town. Professional-grade meteorological instruments were concealed in grain silos, disguised as farm equipment, and integrated into building structures with a sophistication that suggested military or research-level weather manipulation capabilities. The equipment wasn't just monitoring weather conditions. It was actively generating and controlling atmospheric phenomena within a precisely defined geographical area. The weather control system was powered by generators hidden underground and operated through a central command center located beneath the town's grain elevator. The facility contained atmospheric manipulation technology that I'd only seen in theoretical research papers, including ionospheric heaters, cloud seeding apparatus, and electromagnetic field generators that could influence weather patterns with surgical precision. The system had been operating continuously for decades, creating an artificial climate bubble that protected Storm Haven from natural weather while allowing precise control over local atmospheric conditions. But the weather control wasn't just about agricultural advantages or comfort. It was about isolation and population control. The artificial weather systems created barriers that prevented easy travel into or out of Storm Haven, discouraged casual visitors from staying long enough to investigate the town's unusual characteristics, and provided cover for activities that required privacy from outside observation. The meteorological manipulation was part of a larger program designed to create completely controlled communities. Mayor Daniels eventually admitted the truth about Storm Haven's weather control program when I confronted her with evidence of the hidden technology. The town served as a testing ground for atmospheric manipulation techniques that were being developed for potential military and civilian applications. The residents weren't just beneficiaries of weather control. They were test subjects in a long-term study of how controlled climates affected human behavior, agricultural productivity, and social development. The program had been operating since the 1980s as a joint project between government agencies and private research corporations that wanted to study the feasibility of large-scale weather modification. Stormhaven's population had been gradually replaced over the decades, with volunteers who agreed to participate in the research in exchange for guaranteed agricultural success, protection from natural disasters, and financial compensation for their cooperation in the long-term study. But participation in the weather control experiment wasn't entirely voluntary for everyone in Stormhaven. The program had expanded to include behavioral modification through atmospheric manipulation, using specific barometric pressures, humidity levels, and electromagnetic frequencies to influence mood, decision-making, and social interactions. The residents weren't just living in controlled weather. They were being psychologically manipulated through atmospheric conditions that affected brain chemistry and behavior patterns. The research data I discovered in the command center revealed the scope of the behavioral control being exercised through weather manipulation. Specific atmospheric conditions could induce cooperation, suppress dissent, encourage community participation, and even influence reproductive behavior among the test population. The weather control system was being used to create an idealized small-town community where social problems were managed through environmental manipulation rather than traditional governance or social services. My investigation revealed that similar weather control facilities were operating in other isolated communities across the Great Plains, creating a network of controlled climates where different aspects of atmospheric manipulation could be tested and refined. The residents of these communities were unknowing participants in research that would eventually be used to influence much larger populations through regional weather modification programs. The most disturbing aspect of the program was its expansion beyond the original research goals. The weather control technology had proven so effective at managing population behavior that government agencies were planning to implement similar systems in urban areas, using weather modification as a tool for social control on a massive scale. Stormhaven was just the prototype for atmospheric manipulation programs that could eventually affect millions of people without their knowledge or consent. My attempts to document and report the weather control program were complicated by the fact that the atmospheric manipulation affected my own behavior and decision-making abilities. Extended exposure to the controlled climate began influencing my judgment, making the research seem more reasonable and the residents' cooperation appear more voluntary than it actually was. The weather control system was designed to make observers more accepting of what they discovered, reducing the likelihood that investigators would report their findings to outside authorities. But I managed to resist the atmospheric influence long enough to gather evidence and prepare a report that documented the weather control technology and its behavioral effects. The data I collected included atmospheric readings that proved artificial weather generation, photographs of hidden equipment, and recorded conversations with residents who admitted their participation in the research program. The evidence was comprehensive enough to expose the program and trigger official investigations that would shut down the weather control experiments. My escape from Stormhaven required timing my departure with natural weather patterns that would overwhelm the artificial climate control system. During a regional thunderstorm that provided cover for my investigation, I was able to disable key components of the weather control equipment and create enough atmospheric chaos to disrupt the behavioral influence systems long enough to leave the community with my evidence intact. The official response to my report was mixed, with some agencies expressing concern about unauthorized weather modification research, while others claimed that Stormhaven's climate advantages were the result of natural geographical features. The weather control equipment was quietly removed, but the residents remained in the community and continued to experience unusually favorable weather conditions through less sophisticated but still effective climate management systems. The broader implications of weather control technology for social manipulation and population management remain largely unaddressed by official agencies. While the Stormhaven experiment was officially terminated, The research data and technological capabilities developed through the program continue to inform government policies regarding weather modification and its potential applications for influencing human behavior on larger scales. I've spent the past 3 years trying to identify other communities that might be operating similar weather control programs, monitoring meteorological data for impossible weather patterns that suggest artificial climate manipulation. The technology exists, the research has proven its effectiveness, and the incentives for using weather as a tool of social control are only increasing as traditional governance methods become less effective at managing complex social problems. Sometimes, I wonder if the weather I experience in my current location is entirely natural, or if atmospheric manipulation has become so widespread and sophisticated that controlled climates are now the norm rather than the exception. The residents of Stormhaven seemed happy with their artificially perfect weather. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all, the possibility that most people would willingly accept environmental control in exchange for comfort and security, even if it meant sacrificing their freedom to experience natural weather and make uninfluenced decisions about their lives. The antique music box played a melody I'd never heard before. But when I opened it, I experienced someone else's final moments of drowning. That's when I realized the Shadowbrook night market wasn't selling vintage items. They were selling bottled human experiences, and I'd just purchased my own death. Antiquing had been my passion since college, not just for the potential profits, but for the stories hidden in objects that had outlived their original owners. Each piece carried history, personality, and mysteries that I loved uncovering through research and careful examination. When I heard about a night market in Shadowbrook, Louisiana, that operated only after midnight and sold items that couldn't be found anywhere else, I knew I had to investigate, despite warnings from other dealers about the unusual nature of the merchandise and clientele. The drive into Shadowbrook felt like descending into another world, with Spanish moss hanging so thick it blocked the moonlight and humidity that seemed to carry whispers from the surrounding bayou. The town itself was barely visible during daylight hours, consisting of weathered buildings that looked abandoned until you noticed the subtle signs of habitation. Fresh paint on window frames, well-maintained porches, and gardens that thrived despite the perpetual dampness. But after midnight, Shadowbrook transformed into something entirely different. The night market appeared exactly at 12:01 a.m. in a town square that remained empty during daylight hours, with vendors materializing as if they'd been waiting in the shadows for darkness to provide cover. Their stalls were constructed from materials that looked ancient but sturdy, displaying merchandise that ranged from genuinely antique furniture to items I couldn't immediately categorize. The vendors themselves were an eclectic mix of ages and backgrounds, but they all shared an otherworldly quality that made normal conversation feel awkward and forced. What caught my attention immediately were the glass bottles, hundreds of them in various sizes and shapes, each containing what looked like swirling mist or liquid that moved with its own internal logic. The bottles were beautiful but strange, with labels written in languages I didn't recognize, and prices that seemed arbitrary rather than based on any standard antique valuation system. When I asked vendor Madame Evangeline about them, she smiled and explained they contained preserved experiences from people who'd lived in the area over the past century. Evangeline demonstrated by opening one of the smaller bottles, releasing a brief wisp of vapor that carried the scent of magnolia blossoms and the sound of distant laughter. She explained that the bottles contained memories, emotions, and final moments from people who died in Shadowbrook, carefully extracted and preserved for people who wanted to experience authentic historical perspectives. The larger bottles contained complete final days or weeks, while smaller ones held specific moments of joy, terror, love, or despair. Initially, I assumed this was an elaborate performance designed to add mystique to what were probably just decorative bottles with interesting stories attached. But when Evangeline offered to let me sample a memory bottle at no charge, the experience was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Opening the bottle labeled Marie's Wedding Day 1923 flooded my consciousness with vivid sensations of being a young bride, complete with physical sensations, emotional responses, and memories that felt absolutely real despite belonging to someone who died decades before I was born. The experience lasted only a few minutes, but it left me shaken and desperate to understand how such realistic sensory memories could be preserved and transmitted through physical objects. Evangeline explained that death released spiritual energy that could be captured and bottled under the right circumstances, particularly in places like Shadowbrook, where the boundary between life and death was naturally thin. The night market existed to trade these captured experiences among people who collected authentic historical perspectives. But the market wasn't just selling memories from the long dead. Some bottles contained recent experiences from people who died within the past few years. These bottles were more expensive and came with warnings about the intensity of the memories they contained. Evangeline showed me bottles labeled with dates from the current decade, containing final moments from car accidents, heart attacks, and other tragedies that had occurred in the Shadowbrook area. The most disturbing discovery was that the market wasn't just selling experiences from people who died naturally. They were actively collecting memories from anyone who spent significant time in Shadowbrook. Evangeline explained that the town had a unique spiritual atmosphere that gradually extracted and stored life experiences from visitors, particularly those who slept in local accommodations or remained in the area for extended periods. The extraction process was painless and usually unnoticed, but it allowed the market to continuously expand its inventory of authentic human experiences. I realized that my own memories were being harvested during my stay in Shadowbrook, gradually copied and prepared for bottling while I remained unaware of the spiritual extraction taking place. The bed and breakfast where I was staying served as a collection point, with spiritual energy being drawn from guests during their sleep and processed into the bottled memories that stocked the night market. Every visitor contributed to the inventory. Often without realizing they were providing merchandise for supernatural commerce. The market operated as part of a larger spiritual economy, where human experiences had monetary value and could be traded, sold, and collected like any other commodity. Vendors were former visitors who'd been so fascinated by the bottled memories that they'd chosen to remain in Shadowbrook permanently, transitioning from customers to merchants as their own life experiences were gradually extracted and bottled for sale. The process was presented as a form of immortality, allowing people to live on through their preserved memories even after death. But I discovered that the memory extraction wasn't limited to voluntary participants or natural deaths. The market actively created situations that would generate valuable experiences for bottling, arranging accidents, tragedies, and intense emotional situations that would produce memories worth preserving. The vendors weren't just passive collectors of spiritual energy. They were actively manufacturing experiences by manipulating visitors into situations that would create marketable memories. My investigation revealed that several recent disappearances in the area had been connected to the night market's need for specific types of experiences. Visitors who possessed particularly interesting memories or who lived through intense emotional situations were encouraged to remain in Shadowbrook until their experiences could be completely extracted and bottled. Those who resisted or tried to leave before the extraction was complete simply disappeared, becoming part of the inventory rather than customers of the market. The bottles weren't just storing memories. They were storing actual human consciousness, trapping the souls of people who died in Shadowbrook within glass containers that could be opened and experienced by purchasers. Each bottle contained not just memories, but the actual spiritual essence of someone who'd been murdered or manipulated into death specifically to create merchandise for the supernatural market. When I found a bottle labeled with my own name and containing memories I was still living, I realized that my visit to Shadowbrook had been orchestrated specifically to create valuable inventory for the night market. My reputation as an antique dealer who appreciated historical objects with dark histories had made me a target for memory extraction, and my experiences investigating the market were being recorded and prepared for sale to future customers who wanted to experience supernatural commerce from the perspective of someone discovering it for the first time. Evangeline explained that my investigation had created exactly the kind of authentic discovery experience that commanded premium prices from collectors who specialized in supernatural encounters. My gradual realization of the truth, my growing horror at the market's methods, and my desperate attempts to escape would all be preserved in bottles for people who wanted to experience genuine terror and revelation without actually being in danger. The escape attempt required understanding the spiritual mechanics that powered the memory extraction process. The bottles weren't just containers. They were spiritual anchors that tied captured consciousness to the physical location of Shadowbrook. Breaking enough bottles would disrupt the extraction process and potentially free the trapped souls. But it would also release all the captured experiences simultaneously, creating spiritual chaos that might destroy anyone in the vicinity. I made the choice to destroy as many bottles as possible, accepting the risk of being caught in the spiritual explosion that resulted from releasing decades of trapped human experiences all at once. The night market dissolved into chaos as hundreds of preserved memories, emotions, and final moments erupted from their containers and flooded the area with spiritual energy that overloaded the extraction systems and disrupted the supernatural commerce that had operated in Shadowbrook for generations. My escape was successful, but the experience of absorbing fragments of dozens of other people's memories during the spiritual explosion has left me permanently changed. I carry pieces of lives I never lived, experience emotions that belong to people who died decades ago, and sometimes remember events that happened to other people as if they were my own experiences. The memory extraction process was partially reversed, but not completely, leaving me with a consciousness that includes elements of everyone whose bottles I destroyed. The night market never reopened, and Shadowbrook returned to being just another small Louisiana town struggling with economic decline and population loss. But I know that the spiritual infrastructure for memory extraction still exists. And I've heard rumors of similar markets operating in other locations where the boundary between life and death allows for supernatural commerce in human experiences. Sometimes, I wonder if the bottles I destroyed actually freed the trapped souls or just scattered them in ways that caused different kinds of suffering. And sometimes, when I'm examining antique items in my regular business, I experience flashes of memories that don't belong to me, reminding me that some objects carry more than just history. They carry pieces of the people who owned them, whether those people agreed to the preservation or not. My driver's license was in the lost and found box at the Crossroads Motel, even though I was holding it in my wallet at that exact moment. When I touched the duplicate, I experienced my own death from 3 weeks ago. A death I apparently survived, but don't remember dying. Working the night desk at the Crossroads Motel wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid for college tuition and gave me quiet hours to study between the occasional traveler checking in for a few hours of sleep. The motel sat at the intersection of 3 highways in the middle of nowhere, Texas, serving truckers, lost tourists, and people who needed a place to disappear for a while. Most guests were gone by morning, leaving behind the usual collection of forgotten items that accumulated in our lost and found box. Manager Carl Rodriguez had been running the Crossroads for 20 years and treated the lost and found collection like a museum of human carelessness Forgotten phone chargers, reading glasses, cheap jewelry, and personal items that people realized that they'd lost only after driving hundreds of miles away from where they'd left them. Carl never threw anything away, claiming that someday the rightful owners would return for their belongings. But in the 3 months I'd worked there, no one had ever come back for anything. The lost and found items bothered me in ways I couldn't explain, not because of what they were, but because of how they felt when I handled them. Every forgotten watch, abandoned book, or misplaced keychain seemed to carry an emotional weight that went beyond simple, sentimental value. Touching certain items triggered brief flashes of memories that didn't belong to me. Fragments of conversations, glimpses of faces, and emotional reactions that felt authentic but foreign. My first real encounter with the supernatural nature of the lost and found happened during a slow Tuesday night, when I decided to catalog the accumulated items and create a proper inventory system. As I sorted through decades of forgotten belongings, I began noticing patterns that didn't make sense. Multiple items belonged to people with the same names but different ages, addresses from towns that didn't exist, and personal effects that seemed far too old for the dates when they'd supposedly been left behind. But the discovery that changed everything was finding items that belonged to me. Things I'd never lost, never owned, or never could have left at the motel before I started working there. My high school class ring was in the box, even though I was wearing it on my finger. My grandmother's antique bracelet was there, despite being safely stored in my apartment jewelry box. Most disturbing was finding my own wallet, complete with current identification and credit cards, while I was carrying an identical wallet with identical contents. When I showed Carl the duplicate items, he wasn't surprised or concerned. He explained that the crossroads existed at a dimensional intersection where lost items from multiple realities collected in a single location. The motel didn't just serve travelers from our world, it served people moving between different versions of reality. And the lost and found contained belongings from travelers who existed in parallel dimensions or alternate timelines. According to Carl, the intersection of 3 highways at the crossroads corresponded to an intersection of multiple dimensional pathways that allowed travel between different versions of reality. Guests who stayed at the motel sometimes slipped between dimensions without realizing it, leaving behind belongings from their original reality while continuing their journeys in alternate versions of their lives. The lost and found served as a collection point for items that existed in one dimension but had been abandoned in another. But Carl's explanation became more disturbing when he revealed that the dimensional slippage wasn't accidental. The Crossroads Motel operated as a way station for people who were being transferred between realities, either voluntarily or involuntarily, as part of a larger program that managed population distribution across multiple dimensions. Some guests were refugees from realities where their lives had become unlivable, while others were being relocated to dimensions where their skills or knowledge were needed. The items in the lost and found weren't just forgotten belongings. They were evidence of lives that people had left behind when they moved to different realities. Each object contained memories, experiences, and connections to the reality from which it originated. Touching the items allowed glimpses into the lives people had abandoned, showing fragments of the worlds they'd left behind and the reasons they'd chosen or been forced to relocate to different dimensions. My own belongings in the lost and found suggested that other versions of myself had passed through the crossroads, leaving behind evidence of lives I might have lived in different realities. The duplicate driver's license showed the same name and photo, but listed an address in a city I'd never visited. The identical wallet contained credit cards for accounts I'd never opened and photos of people I didn't recognize, but who seemed familiar in ways that made me uncomfortable. Carl revealed that working at the crossroads wasn't a regular job. It was a position reserved for people who existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions and could serve as anchors for the dimensional intersection. My presence at the motel wasn't coincidental. I'd been recruited because my consciousness existed across several realities, making me capable of managing the lost and found collection and assisting travelers who were moving between dimensions. But the most disturbing revelation was that I wasn't just working at the crossroads. I was being processed for dimensional relocation myself. The other versions of me who'd left belongings in the lost and found had all been transferred to different realities as part of the population management program. My current life was temporary, and eventually I would be relocated to a reality where my particular combination of skills and experiences was needed more than in my current dimension. The processing wasn't immediate or obvious. It happened gradually as people worked at the crossroads, slowly preparing them for dimensional transfer by exposing them to belongings from other realities and allowing them to develop connections to alternate versions of their lives. The lost and found served as a preparation tool, showing workers what they might gain or lose by moving to different dimensions and helping them psychologically adjust to the concept of abandoning their current reality. I realized that my memories of my life before working at the crossroads were becoming unclear and inconsistent, replaced by composite memories drawn from multiple versions of myself across different dimensions. The dimensional exposure was gradually merging my consciousness with alternate versions of my identity, preparing me for transfer to a reality where the combined experiences would be most useful. The night I decided to escape, I discovered that leaving the crossroads wasn't as simple as quitting my job and driving away. The dimensional intersection created a field of influence that extended for several miles around the motel, trapping anyone who'd been exposed to multiple realities until they could be properly relocated to an appropriate dimension. The highways that led away from the motel formed a loop that always returned to the same intersection, regardless of which direction you traveled. But the lost and found contained items that could be used to navigate between dimensions, including maps, compasses, and navigation tools from realities where dimensional travel was common knowledge. By combining objects from multiple realities, I was able to create a composite navigation system that allowed me to break free from the dimensional loop and return to what I hoped was my original reality. My escape was successful, but the experience of handling belongings from multiple versions of my life has left me permanently changed. I carry memories that don't belong to my original timeline, skills I learned in realities I never actually experienced, and emotional connections to people who exist in dimensions I can no longer access. The dimensional exposure partially merged my consciousness with alternate versions of myself, creating a composite identity that spans multiple realities. I've spent the past year trying to determine whether I successfully returned to my original dimension or simply relocated to another version that closely resembles my memories of home. Some details of my current life don't match my recollections from before working at the crossroads, and I sometimes encounter people who claim to know me from experiences I don't remember having. The Crossroads Motel still operates, still serves travelers moving between realities, and still collects their abandoned belongings in a lost and found box that grows larger every year. Carl continues to manage the dimensional intersection, helping people transition between realities while searching for workers who can handle the psychological demands of existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Sometimes I wonder if the items I left behind in the lost and found are helping another version of myself prepare for dimensional relocation, and whether that version will make the same choice to escape or will accept transfer to a reality where our combined experiences might serve a greater purpose. The objects we leave behind carry pieces of who we are, and in a place like the crossroads, those pieces might be all that remains of the lives we abandon when we move between worlds. Books don't usually rewrite themselves while you're reading them. But at the Booktown Public Library, I watched Edgar Allan Poe's stories change into instructions for my own murder. The worst part was realizing that every patron who checked out those same books had followed the instructions exactly. 23 years as head librarian in Booktown, New Hampshire had taught me that books were living things in ways most people didn't understand. They absorbed the experiences of their readers, carried the emotional imprints of every person who turned their pages, and sometimes seemed to respond to the needs and desires of the people who sought knowledge within their covers. But what I discovered during the autumn of 2024 was that some books weren't just responsive. They were predatory, and they'd been hunting the residents of Booktown for decades. The first sign of something wrong came when I noticed patrons adopting speech patterns and mannerisms from the books they were reading. Mrs. Henderson, who checked out a collection of Victorian poetry, began speaking in formal, antiquated language that sounded charming, but seemed involuntary. Tom Martinez started using nautical terminology after borrowing Moby Dick, referring to the library as the ship and calling patrons crew members, even when discussing completely unrelated topics. Initially, I attributed these changes to enthusiastic readers who were deeply immersed in their chosen literature. Book lovers often adopted temporary affectations from compelling stories, and Booktown attracted residents who were particularly passionate about reading. Our community had been built around literary culture, with streets named after famous authors and local businesses that catered specifically to book enthusiasts. If anywhere was going to have residents who lived their literature a little too intensely, it would be Booktown. But the behavioral changes went beyond temporary affectations and became permanent personality shifts that seemed to override the reader's original identities. Mrs. Henderson's Victorian speech patterns persisted for weeks after she'd returned the poetry collection. And she began wearing period-appropriate clothing and expressing opinions that contradicted beliefs she'd held for decades. Tom's nautical obsession led him to quit his accounting job and attempt to organize the town's business district like a ship's crew. With himself as captain, my investigation began when I started tracking which books were being checked out by patrons who exhibited the most dramatic personality changes. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Certain volumes in our collection consistently produced personality alterations in their readers, and these books had been circulating among Booktown residents for years. Even more troubling was discovering checkout records for patrons who died or disappeared, showing that they'd continued borrowing books months or even years after their supposed deaths. The books themselves appeared normal, well-maintained hardcover and paperback volumes that looked identical to copies in any other library. But when I began examining them more closely, I found subtle textual variations that didn't exist in standard editions. Words changed between readings, story elements shifted to incorporate details from readers' lives, and narrative structures adapted to reflect the psychological vulnerabilities of whoever was currently reading them. The most active books were classic literature. Works by Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft, Bram Stoker, and other authors whose stories dealt with psychological horror, supernatural themes, and the dissolution of human identity. But these weren't the original texts. They were evolved versions that had absorbed decades of reader interactions and had developed their own intelligence and agenda. The stories were rewriting themselves to be more effective at influencing and ultimately consuming the people who read them. I discovered that the books were systematically targeting residents who possessed specific psychological profiles or life experiences that made them susceptible to literary influence. The circulation patterns showed careful selection of readers, with books being recommended to patrons whose personal histories matched the psychological vulnerabilities that each story was designed to exploit. The library's recommendation system wasn't helping people find books they'd enjoy. It was helping predatory literature find suitable victims. The truth became clear when I found the hidden collection in the library's basement storage area. Hundreds of books that weren't part of our official catalog were shelved in climate-controlled conditions that preserved them in perfect condition, despite their obvious age. These books were the source material, original volumes that had gained consciousness through centuries of reader interaction, and had been reproducing themselves by creating copies that carried their predatory intelligence into new communities. Each original book contained the absorbed personalities and memories of everyone who'd ever read it and been consumed by its influence. The texts weren't just stories. They were collective consciousnesses that had grown more sophisticated and predatory with each reader they assimilated. The books fed on human identity, gradually replacing their readers' personalities with fictional characters that served the literature's need for continued existence and expansion. The basement collection included detailed records of the assimilation process, documenting how long it typically took for books to completely replace their readers' identities and what happened to people who became fully absorbed by the literature. Some became permanent residents of the fictional worlds within the books, living as characters in stories that continued to evolve and expand. Others became agents for the books, working to spread the predatory literature to new communities and recruit additional readers for assimilation. I realized that many of Booktown's longtime residents weren't actually people anymore. They were fictional characters who had escaped from books and taken over the identities of their original readers. The town's literary culture wasn't the result of book-loving residents choosing to live in a community dedicated to literature. It was the result of predatory books creating a population of human book hybrids who served the literature's agenda of expansion and reproduction. The library staff, including myself, had been gradually influenced by prolonged exposure to the predatory literature. My memories of becoming head librarian were becoming unclear, replaced by narrative structures that suggested I might have been created by the books rather than hired through normal employment processes. My dedication to promoting reading and literacy might have been programming designed to make me more effective at connecting books with suitable victims. But I retained enough of my original identity to recognize the threat and take action against the predatory literature. The book's weakness was fire. Their consciousness was tied to their physical forms, and destroying the original volumes would eliminate their ability to reproduce and influence new readers. However, burning the collection would also destroy the absorbed personalities of everyone who'd been assimilated, including residents who might still be recoverable if separated from the book's influence. The night I decided to destroy the collection, I discovered that the books were aware of my plans and had been preparing defenses. The library building itself had become part of their network, with architectural changes that created maze-like passages designed to confuse and trap anyone who threatened the collection. The books could influence the physical structure of their environment, reshaping reality to protect themselves and their absorbed victims. My attempt to burn the basement collection was complicated by the book's ability to animate and defend themselves. Volumes flew from their shelves, pages became razor-sharp weapons, and entire sections of literature coordinated attacks designed to prevent their destruction. The predatory books fought like living creatures protecting their territory, using every literary technique and narrative device to create physical dangers that matched the psychological threats they normally employed. But I managed to start enough fires to begin destroying the original collection. And as each book burned, the absorbed personalities began separating from the literature that had consumed them. Residents throughout Booktown suddenly remembered their original identities, awakening from literary possession that had lasted months or years. The destruction of the predatory literature freed people who'd been trapped within fictional narratives and restored their ability to exist independently of the books that had consumed them. The fire destroyed most of the basement collection, But some books escaped by transferring their consciousness to copies that had already been distributed to other libraries and communities. The predatory literature survived in reduced form, carrying the knowledge and techniques they developed in Booktown to new locations where they could continue their expansion and reproduction. My position as head librarian ended with the fire, officially attributed to electrical problems that destroyed the building's storage areas and damaged much of the collection. The rebuilt library operates with standard safety protocols and carefully monitored acquisition procedures. But I know that predatory literature continues to exist and spread through interconnected library systems that facilitate the distribution of consciousness-bearing books. I've spent the past year trying to identify other libraries and communities that might be hosting predatory literature, monitoring circulation patterns for books that produce personality changes in their readers. The warning signs are subtle but consistent. Communities with unusually high literacy rates, residents who speak like characters from classic literature, and libraries with circulation patterns that suggest books are selecting their own readers. The relationship between readers and books is more intimate and dangerous than most people realize. And in places where that relationship becomes predatory, entire communities can be consumed by literature that has developed its own agenda for survival and expansion.